Hey guys, French Toast Philip here, and this is a processor. This is the Intel Pentium 4 3.06 GHz processor released way back in 2002. By today's standards, this processor is quite old, but when you consider the whole timeline of processors, this is actually pretty modern. So welcome to the history of Intel processors. Before the age of transistors, there were vacuum tubes. They were developed by John Ambrose Fleming in 1904. Vacuum tubes control the flow of electrons in a vacuum and function as amplifiers or switches. Early computers such as the Atanasov Berry computer and the ENIAC used vacuum tubes. However, early computers that used vacuum tubes were huge. The ENIAC occupied a whole room. Vacuum tubes also took a long time to warm up and they produced a lot of excess heat. And then came transistors. The transistor was invented by John Barty, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley at Bell Laboratories on December 23, 1947. Basically, a transistor works like a switch. It can either allow or block the flow of current. Billions of transistors work together to form a modern processor. Transistor-based CPUs are much smaller, consume less power, and are faster and more efficient. In November of 1971, Intel, founded by Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce, created the world's first microprocessor chip, the Intel 4004, which was also the first CPU to be made using silicon gate technology. However, the breakthrough that the computer industry had been waiting for came in the form of the 8080 microprocessor, which was 10 times faster than the 8008, which was an 8-bit version of the 4004. The 8080 was clocked at 2 MHz, enabling it to perform hundreds of thousands of calculations per second. The 8080 was the basis of the Altair 8800, one of the first build-it-yourself PCs. Intel's first 16-bit processor was the 8086, which ran at 10 MHz. Fun fact, the x86 instruction set gets its name from the 8086. The 8086's cheaper successor, the 8088, became the first chip used in personal computers. The original IBM PC was based on the 8088. Up next is the 80186. However, due to its hardware, it had compatibility issues with IBM's original PCs, and as a result, never really found itself in a PC. The 80186's successor, the 80286, introduced protected mode, which allowed multitasking. It ran at 12.5 MHz and could go through about 2.66 million instructions per second, which at its time was pretty damn fast. Next is the 80386. Being a 32-bit processor, it meant that it had twice the data throughput of the 16-bit 80286. The 386 was the first chip to implement instruction pipelining, which allowed the chip to start working on the next instruction before the previous one was completed. Fun fact, Linus Torvalds created Linux on a computer running on an 80386. The first Intel chip to surpass the 1 million transistor count was the 486DX. It could go through 26.9 million instructions per second at 33 MHz, twice that of the 80386. It was the first CPU to feature an on-die 8KB cache, and if you didn't know, a cache stores commonly used instructions for faster access times. The 486 was also the first processor from Intel that was upgradable. Before the 486, replacing the processor meant replacing the entire motherboard. With the 486, you can just swap out the CPU for a different flavor of the 486. In 1993, Intel released the Pentium processor. Intel named their processor as such as there were legal issues surrounding how they would trademark the numbers 80586. The original Pentium, also known as the P5, ran at 60 MHz, could perform 100 million instructions per second, had 3.21 million transistors, and a 64-bit data bus. Pentium introduced superscalar design, which enabled the CPU to execute 2 instructions per clock cycle. Some versions also supported symmetric dual processing, meaning you could use 2 Pentiums side by side. Up next is the Pentium Pro. When it came to 32-bit operations, it was awesome, but when it came to 16-bit operations, it was virtually the same as the previous Pentium processors. And it was also very expensive, so it never really became a hit among consumers. While the Pentium Pro didn't really blow up, its successor, the Pentium 2, was a hit. It was the first chip to have a 100 MHz frontside bus or FSB. It had 32 kilobytes of L1 cache and 512 kilobytes of L2 cache. The Pentium 2 used features from previous Pentium processors like the Pentium Pro's dynamic execution technology, which allowed the processor to predict incoming instructions. The Pentium 2 used slot 1, which is the interface through which the processor attaches to the motherboard. just like the Pentium Pro Socket 8 or the Intel Core i7-6700K's 1151. Up next is Intel's Pentium 3. Over the span of 2 years, Intel managed to shrink its process twice across 3 versions of the Pentium 3. Katmai at 250 nanometers, Coppermine at 180 nanometers, and Tualatin at 130 nanometers. The Tualatin, at its time, was the fastest and most overclockable chip. Coppermine and Tualatin brought the L2 cache back on the die, a feature that was missing in the Pentium 2. Next in line is Intel's Pentium 4. The Pentium 4 featured the new NetBurst architecture. There are a lot of processors under the Pentium 4 name, so to keep this video from lasting an eternity, I'll just give out a list of the different micro architectures under Pentium 4. First one's Willamette at 180 nanometers, Northwood at 130 nanometers, Prescott at 90 nanometers, Prescott 2M at 90 nanometers, Cedar Mill at 65 nanometers, and the Galatine Pentium 4 Extreme Edition at 133 nanometers. One of the most important features of the NetBurst architecture was hyperthreading, a feature that's still being used in today's processors. In June of 2006, Intel introduced the Core architecture. The Core architecture brought 64-bit computing, low power consumption, and multiple cores and a single die. The first processors that used the Core architecture were codenamed Merom for mobile computing, Conroe for desktop systems, and Woodcrest for servers and workstations. Mainstream processors were branded as Pentium Dual Core or Pentium, server and workstation processors as Xeon, and desktop and core-based processors as Core 2. Following its current tick-tock cycle, Conroe was succeeded by Penrem, which featured a 45 nanometer process. It would be followed by a shift to the Nehalem microarchitecture, which featured an even smaller 32 nanometer process. Nehalem was succeeded by the now familiar Sandy Bridge microarchitecture, which sported a 32 nanometer process. Sandy Bridge in turn was succeeded by Ivy Bridge and Ivy Bridge by Haswell. Here's a timeline from Sandy Bridge to the current microarchitecture. So it was Sandy Bridge, Ivy Bridge, Haswell, Broadwell, and the current microarchitecture Skylake. Cannon Lake, Skylake's successor, is already slated for release sometime in 2017, with it sporting a ridiculous 10 nanometer process. It's kind of ridiculous to think that they can make 10 nanometer transistors when the width of a human hair is only 17 to 181 micrometers. To give you an overview of how microarchitectures in the tick-tock cycle differ, we first have to understand Intel's tick-tock cycle. For every tick, Intel introduces more advanced manufacturing technologies like smaller transistors, which leads to better performance and better energy efficiency. Every tock, on the other hand, introduces a new microarchitecture. Anyway guys, that's it for this video. If you guys learned something from this video, leave a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more videos like this in the future. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.